In this tutorial, I'm going to be reviewing some of the data transformation techniques available in Power BI. In Power BI, you make connections to different data sources, and then you can use transform data to pivot, manipulate, and transpose this relational information so you can get the data into the format you need to tell your story. What I'll be working with here is a data set that was exported out of Semantic version 3 for displaying 3D Rhino information in Power BI. So here you can see on screen we have a 3D model that's being generated from this table of elements and itemized element records. But these elements are also related to a property table. And these property tables contain itemized records of all of the properties associated with these elements. And it's being managed through this data relationship where element ID is connecting into element ID. And if we go ahead and look at this table itself, we can see that we have itemized rows for all of the properties for these elements. Now, this is a very efficient way to manage a relational database structure, but it is not as efficient from a data visualization standpoint. So you can see that we have itemized rows for all of these properties and their values, and we have fields for name and value. What we would want from a data viz standpoint are these individual properties itemized by column with then their values associated in these column records. So then we could drag and drop those fields and do different things with the visualization, such as color code or add different tooltips and such. So in order to do that, I'm going to go into the transform data environment, and we're going to perform a series of operations using some of the filtering that's available here, the merge queries function, and a number of other transformation steps. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find my element property table here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make a reference copy of this table to work with. So you can see that we have this ability to duplicate the table. We also can create a reference copy. I find it more efficient to use reference copies because when you duplicate the table, Power BI automatically creates a new query to reference that same table, whereas a reference copy queries that table once, then populates both tables. So I find references to be a little bit better from just a data access efficiency standpoint. Now that we have this reference table created, we're going to go through a set of steps to isolate a specific property that we're going to want to use in our report in a column-oriented manner. So everything here is row-oriented. I want to make a column-oriented table of sorts. So you can see that we have this name field here, and what I'm going to do is isolate a specific property that I'm going to want to use in my report. So I'm going to go ahead and uncheck everything, and I'm going to isolate just the color property because maybe I want to use the color property to drive the colors in my three-dimensional visual. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK there. And what that's going to do is it's going to filter out all of the other properties, so we now only have the color property available. The next step that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and remove columns that I know I will not need in the report moving forward initially. So I'm going to go ahead and select this name field here that says color. I'm going to go ahead and select the property definition GUID and also this property ID. And after I do this, I can right click and I can choose to remove those columns. Now, one of the interesting things about this whole process so far is that these steps are being applied in the record of this table. So if I ever want to go back in time and say, oh, I didn't mean to remove those columns, you can remove those different steps. So this can be really convenient as a way to go back in time and manage these transformations. It's kind of, I guess you could say, parametric in that way. So the next step I'm going to do here is I'm going to rename this column to refer to what value this actually is. Because we remove the name field, we're now going to just call this value field by what the name of that property is, right? So I'm going to go ahead and rename this column. So if I right click there and click rename, I'm going to call this color. So now we have this set of properties isolated. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to right click on this, the name of the data source that's been created here. And I'm also going to rename this. I'm going to call this element property, be all one word there. And I'm going to just call it color, like so. So now that I have this reference table created, I'm going to go ahead and also duplicate this record, this table here, because what I want to do is isolate another property that isn't color. And I'm going to go ahead, so in this case I'm going to duplicate it. I'm not going to reference it because if I reference it, these transformation steps are going to be referenced, but I just want to duplicate it so it's going to, so I can perform the same set of transformations here. So I'm going to duplicate it here, and we can see that we have those transformation steps applied. And maybe what I want to do here is go back to the filtered row transformation, and you can see that there's a settings piece here. So instead of filtering rows based on color, I can use this interface to select a different property. Maybe in this case I want to isolate area. So the area of each of these panels will be isolated instead. So I can then kind of verify that these transformation steps are being applied, and this last step here where I've renamed the column, I'm going to remove that step, and I'm going to go ahead and rename it to a different name. So I can call this one area. And maybe just to ensure that Power BI understands, I also want to make sure this area column is numeric. So I can also go to the transform tab here, and I can ensure that instead of data type text, that this column should be a decimal number. And again, all of these transformations are applying as steps on this data source. So it's really easy to track what's been done. And I'm going to go ahead and again rename this particular table here as well to be element property. Instead of color 2, I'm going to call it the area, like such. So now we have two isolated tables that are indicating one property over another. And the final step I'm going to do here is I'm going to merge these tables together using the element ID. And the element ID becomes the mechanism by which we can relate these two different property sets together. So if I go over here up into the ribbon tab, you can see I have merge queries, and I'm going to go ahead and choose to do a merge query as a new table. And this new merged together table will have these properties together in a single table. So I'm going to go ahead and do merge as new. And you can see that we've got element property color as one, and I'm going to choose element property area as the second one. And then we're going to merge them on the element ID column, because the element ID column is how we're going to be able to understand how these records relate to each other. And I'm going to hit OK. Now our new merge table is going to now have this combined data set, and you can see that it's got our color record, but then it's got element property area together, which I can then expand. And in this case, I don't need to have element ID because we've already got it over here. And because this element ID is coming from the other table, so I don't need it. I just hit OK. And we now have color and area. And what I might also do here is do a little bit further formatting and apply the name of the property there at the top to make it a little bit more cleaner, right? So now we have this new table that has pivoted, or I guess transposed, the properties that were originally itemized here as rows. We've now created a merge table that is creating those properties as columns. And I can go ahead and rename this final merge table together as the color area property table. And you can repeat those steps as many times as you want to get the specific properties you want in this format. So it kind of scales in that way. Now, because these data transformations are stored in the file, this may seem like a laborious set of steps to go through initially, but once the setup is complete, you can reuse this setup. You could save this as a template, for example, and apply it to other projects if you need to. A couple of other things that you might want to consider before you load this back into the report environment is that if you right-click on any of these data sources, you can choose whether or not these sources are loaded into the Power BI report. So in this case, we're using this element property color and this element property area table as a mid step to get to this combined property table here. But we don't necessarily need these in our report. So you can always right click on these and say, hey, I don't want to enable the loading of these tables into my report. So I can go ahead and uncheck those. And I'm going to go ahead and close and apply this now to the report. And so what's going to happen is that Power BI is going to take those tables and reload them into our report environment. And what we should see is that the color and area property table is now listed here in our available fields list. And this is now what I can use to continue building my report. Now, one thing you might want to check after you do these manipulations is go back to your relationship manager and ensure that color and area property is being joined into the element set. And you can see that we do have a bidirectional connection between the element table and this color area property table. So what I can do now is take, for example, with my 3D visual selected, I can now take my color input and apply it to the color field directly. So now we've isolated colors in the visual, and the visual will now go through the process of updating and reloading that color data. And I also need to go through the extra step of going to our data style here and ensuring that the color record is set to single or rule, which will then apply those color fields to it. Usually, in some cases, it's expecting categories, which will color override. In this case, we need to make sure that the visual is set to read from this color field. So here we have it. We have our color records being applied, and we can also then take our area property here and put it into our tooltips. So now that area field will exist here, and if I hover over any of these panels, you can see that we're now reporting the area of each of those panels in that particular tooltip. Okay, so I hope that this video provided you with a good introduction to using Power BI's data transformation capabilities. There are numerous ways with which you can transform data within Power BI and get it into a state that will satisfy your use case. And one of the advantages of Power BI is that those data transformation steps do get retained and recorded, meaning that we can templatize them and reuse them from project to project, especially if you know you're going to be dealing with data in a very specific format. So hopefully this provided you with a good overview, and good luck as you start to work with your data in Power BI.